My mom called me on a Tuesday morning in October, which should have been my first warning. She never calls on weekdays. She texts short, clipped messages that read more like memos than conversation. Running late. Can you pick up Lily from school? Or dinner Sunday? Don't forget. The kind of messages that communicate information without asking how you are. So, when my phone rang at 8:14 inches the morning, and her name lit up the screen, I was already setting down my coffee before I answered. The reading is Thursday, she said, without hello. 2:00. Hargrove's office on Clement Street. You should be there. I told her I'd be there. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat at my kitchen table in Portland for a long time after that, looking out at the November rain, which in Oregon is less of a weather event and more of a permanent condition. My grandmother had been gone for 9 days. 9 days, and the last conversation I'd had with my mother was a 4-word text telling me the funeral was Wednesday. I'd driven down to Medford alone, 6 hours through the mountains, and sat in the back of St. Catherine's while my mother and my uncle stood in the front row looking like people who had already moved on to the next item on the agenda. I want to tell you about my grandmother before I tell you the rest, because the rest doesn't make any sense without her. Her name was Rosemarie Antoinette Delacroix, and she went by Rosie to everyone who loved her, which was most of the Rogue Valley. She was 79 when she died. She'd been born in the same town she died in. Grown up in a house 3 blocks from the bakery, she would spend 61 years of her life building into something that people drove 2 hours for. The kind of place that gets written about in the kind of food magazines that make a point of finding things other magazines haven't found yet. Delacroix's, on Main Street in Jacksonville, Oregon. Blue shutters, a hand-painted sign that my great-grandfather had made from a piece of walnut he cut from a tree that fell in the ice storm of 1952. The sign had been repainted maybe a dozen times over the decades, but always by hand, always the same style of lettering, because my grandmother believed that some things earned the right to stay exactly as they were. I spent my summers there from the time I was 7 until I left for culinary school in San Francisco at 18. My parents' marriage was one of those marriages that looks functional from a distance and is exhausting up close, not cruel, just airless. And my mother's solution, starting the summer after 2nd grade, was to send me south to Jacksonville for June, July, and most of August. I don't think she knew she was giving me the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm not sure she would have done it if she had. My grandmother taught me how to make croissants the right way, which is to say the slow way, the way where you feel the butter folding into the dough, and you understand with your hands what you can't quite get from reading about it. She taught me how to listen to a customer who is difficult in a way that makes them feel heard without agreeing to anything you can't deliver. She taught me that a business built on something real, on craft, on quality, on a genuine understanding of what people need when they walk through a door, can survive almost anything, except being abandoned by the people who inherit it. She said that last part to me once when I was 16. The summer, my Uncle Elliot started bringing his real estate friends around for what he called consultations about the property's potential. We were in the back kitchen at 5 in the morning, the way we always were, and she set down her bench scraper and looked at me with the kind of directness that felt like being seen in full. "A place like this," she said, "is not an asset. It's a responsibility. The difference matters more than people realize until it's too late." I became a pastry chef. I worked in San Francisco for 4 years, then in Chicago for 3. And when I was 28, I opened a small cafe of my own in Portland that did well enough to keep me up at night in the good way rather than the bad way. I came back to Jacksonville 3 or 4 times a year, and every time I walked into Delacroix's, I felt the particular thing that I still don't have a precise word for, something between relief and recognition. Like a part of my nervous system that had been slightly clenched since I left, finally remembered how to relax. My grandmother's health had been declining for about 18 months before she died. Her heart, same as it is for a lot of women in their late 70s, quiet and determined, and then suddenly not. She'd kept working through most of it because she was constitutionally incapable of not working. But by last spring, she was doing half days, and by September, she was letting her longtime manager, a woman named Delia, who'd been with Delacroix's for 22 years, run the floor while she sat at the corner table and did the books and pretended she wasn't tired. My mother and my Uncle Elliot had not been to Jacksonville more than twice in those 18 months. I know this because Delia told me, without editorializing. The way Delia tells you everything, just the facts, no embellishment, and you can draw your own conclusions. I visited 6 times. I stayed for 2 weeks in August when it became clear that my grandmother's cardiologist was managing expectations rather than prognosis. I was with her when she passed. A Thursday morning in October, earlier than I'd expected, the light in her bedroom just starting to go gold, and the smell of the bakery, butter and yeast, and something warm and fundamental coming through the window from the kitchen 2 doors down, where Delia had already started the morning prep because my grandmother had told her, very specifically, to keep the doors open on time. She died the way she'd lived, quietly, specifically, without making a fuss about it. I drove to my mother's house in Grants Pass the next day. She was already talking about the property, not unkindly, just practically, in the way that my mother approaches most things, which is to identify the most efficient path between where she is and where she intends to be. Delacroix sat on a commercially zoned parcel in the historic district of Jacksonville, 3 to 1,000 square feet of building, a separate storage structure, and a small apartment on the 2nd floor where my grandmother had lived for the last 15 years. The whole parcel had been appraised at just over $2 million when my grandmother refinanced the building to buy the adjacent lot in 2019. That was before the Southern Oregon food tourism market went the direction it went. It's probably worth closer to 2 to 8 or 3, my mother said, over coffee at her kitchen counter. There's a hospitality group out of Bend that's been buying up historic commercial properties in the valley. They do boutique hotels. Elliot has already been in contact. I asked her what she meant by in contact. Preliminary conversations, she said. Nothing signed. I didn't say anything else that night. I went back to my rental and I sat with what I was feeling, which was not entirely clean. I loved Delacroix. I knew what it was worth, not the number the appraisers would arrive at, but the other kind of worth, the kind that doesn't have a column in a spreadsheet. I also knew that I had a business of my own in Portland, a lease, employees, a life I'd built carefully over the course of 7 years. I couldn't just move back to Jacksonville and take over a 60-year-old bakery as if the last decade hadn't happened. Or so I told myself that night. The will reading was at 2 o'clock on Thursday, in the offices of Patricia Hargrove, who had been my grandmother's attorney for 11 years. Her office was on Clement Street in Medford, 2nd floor of a brick building that had probably been a dentist's office at some point. She was a compact, unhurried woman in her early 60s with the kind of manner that suggests she has seen a great many families in the hours after a death and has stopped being surprised by any of them. My mother sat to my left. My uncle Elliot sat to her left. He'd driven up from Ashland and brought his second wife, Colleen, who had not been invited and said nothing during the entire reading, which is more than I can say for the energy she brought into the room. Ms. Hargrove read through the preliminary provisions, the personal effects, the vehicle, the bank accounts, in a measured voice. Then she came to Delacroix. The bakery and the parcel it occupied, together with the adjacent lot my grandmother had purchased in 2019, the commercial equipment, the business name, and all associated trademarks and goodwill, and the existing inventory of recipes, the last item listed specifically, with the kind of deliberate specificity that a good attorney uses when they want something to be unambiguous, were left jointly to Sandra Louise Bauer and Elliot James Delacroix, my mother and uncle, to be held and managed at their sole discretion. I received a bequest of $30,000 and my grandmother's recipe journals, 7 of them, handwritten, going back to 1971, along with a note from Ms. Hargrove that these had been left to me with love, and with the full confidence that they will be used well. My mother reached over and touched my arm briefly, a gesture she intended as kind. My Uncle Elliot did not look at me at all. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that room, because I've thought about it long enough to be accurate. It wasn't primarily about the money. $30,000 is not a small amount. The journals were irreplaceable. But I looked at my mother and my uncle sitting across from Patricia Hargrove, and I thought about the hospitality group from Bend, the boutique hotels, the historic commercial properties, and I felt something very specific. The fear of a person watching a door close on something that cannot be reopened. I drove back to my rental alone. Delia called me that evening. She was composed, the way Delia is always composed, but I could hear something underneath it. She said my grandmother had asked her, about 6 months earlier, to keep a box in the safe in the back office. A sealed box, cream-colored, with my name written on it in my grandmother's handwriting. My grandmother had told her to keep it until she was told otherwise. "Has anyone asked you about it?" I said. "No," Delia said. "I don't think anyone knows it exists. Did she tell you anything about it?" Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She told me it was for when it was needed. She said I'd know when." I drove to the bakery that night. Delia was closing up, wiping down the display cases, and she let me in through the side door without a word. The kitchen smelled like it always smelled, the deep, good smell of a place that has been making honest things for a very long time, and I stood in the middle of it for a moment and breathed it in, the way you breathe in something you're afraid you might be saying goodbye to. Delia brought the box from the safe. It was about the size of a shoebox, heavier than I expected. My name was written across the top in blue ink in my grandmother's careful, slightly slanted handwriting. There was a strip of clear tape sealing it shut, with her initials written across the tape in the same ink. "She told me," Delia said carefully, "that I should make sure you had it before any decisions were made about the building." I took the box back to my rental. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then, I put my hands flat on the top of it and thought about my grandmother at 5 a.m. in her kitchen, setting down her bench scraper and telling me that the difference between an asset and a responsibility matters more than people realize until it's too late. I did not open it that night. I'm not sure I can explain exactly why. It felt like something that deserved daylight. I called Patricia Hargrove the next morning at 8:30. I told her about the box. There was a brief silence on her end. And then she said, in a voice that was carefully neutral, "I think you should bring it to my office today, if possible." I asked her why. She said she thought it would be better to open it in a professional context. I was there by 10. Ms. Hargrove had cleared her morning. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her and a cup of coffee. And when I set the box on her desk, she looked at it with the expression of a person who recognizes something they have been expecting. "Did my grandmother discuss this with you?" I asked. She chose her words carefully. "Your grandmother was an exceptionally thorough woman," she said. "She planned for a number of contingencies over the years. I was aware that certain documents existed. I was not aware of the specific contents of this one." I opened the box. Inside, beneath a layer of tissue paper, was a sealed envelope cream. Like the box, my name again in blue ink, and beneath that, a second envelope marked "Legal Documents Patricia Hargrove, Esq. In my grandmother's handwriting, I handed Miss Hargrove her envelope first. She opened it. She read for several minutes without speaking. I watched her face, which gave me very little, until she looked up. "This is a signed and notarized codicil to your grandmother's will," she said. "Dated 14 months ago. It was not filed with the court." I asked what that meant. A codicil is a legal amendment to an existing will. It modifies the original document. When properly executed and filed, it supersedes the provisions it addresses. She set the papers down with the specific deliberateness of a person who wants to be precise. Your grandmother executed this correctly. She had it witnessed and notarized. She chose not to file it at the time of signing. The instructions attached to this document indicate that it was to be filed only in the event that the primary beneficiaries, your mother and your uncle, initiated or agreed to any conversation with a commercial developer, hotel group, or entity seeking to convert the property to non-food service use within 120 days of the original will being read. I looked at her. "Your grandmother appears to have been aware," Ms. Hargrove said carefully, "that her son had already been in contact with the Cascade Hospitality Group prior to her death. The codicil was prepared in anticipation of what she believed would occur after the reading." She paused. "The codicil transfers full ownership of Delacroix' the property, the business, the adjacent lot, the name, the equipment, and all associated assets to you, along with an operational trust of $450,000 to be used specifically for the continued operation of the bakery as a food service business." I don't know how long I sat there without speaking. Long enough that Miss Hargrove got up and poured me a glass of water from the credenza behind her desk and set it in front of me without comment. "There's a letter," I said finally. The envelope with my name on it was still in my hands. "Yes," she said. "I'll give you a moment." She stepped out. I opened the envelope. My grandmother's handwriting was unhurried. Wide letters with slightly exaggerated loops, The kind of handwriting that belongs to a person who learned it before everything became a keyboard. It looked like her. Reading it felt like being in the same room as her. My darling, if you are reading this, then things happened the way I was fairly certain they would. I want you to understand something important. I am not angry. I made my peace with who your mother and your uncle are a long time ago. People are who they are, and love doesn't require you to pretend otherwise. What I am is practical. I built Delacroix for 61 years. I built it from nothing real, a bit of money my father left me, and a recipe for brioche that I learned from a woman in Lyon who was already old when I met her. I built it slowly, carefully, in the way that things last. And I always knew that the question wasn't whether I would die, but whether what I built would survive me. You are the only person in this family who understands what it means to make something with your hands and your whole attention. I watched you figure that out in my kitchen when you were 9 years old, elbow deep in dough, completely still in the way that people are still when they've found the thing they're meant for. I have been waiting for you to come back to it ever since. Delia knows everything. She has been running this place honestly for 22 years, and she will continue to if you ask her right, which I think you know how to do. The trust is enough for 5 years of careful operation. After that, it will need to stand on its own, which it will, because you know how. I am not asking you to be resentful on my behalf. Resentment is a weight, and the floor of a bakery is already hard enough on your knees. I am asking you to make good bread. I am asking you to keep the sign. All my love, and then some. Grandmère. Ms. Hargrove walked me through the legal specifics when she came back in. The codicil, once filed with the probate court, which could be done immediately, would legally amend the original will. My mother and uncle would be notified by certified letter that afternoon. They had the right to contest, but my grandmother had, as Ms. Hargrove put it with quiet precision, taken considerable care to ensure the document would withstand scrutiny. It had been witnessed by 2 individuals with no connection to the estate, notarized by a notary public in Medford, and prepared with a level of specificity that strongly suggested my grandmother had anticipated exactly what a challenge might look like. I drove back to Jacksonville. I went straight to Delacroix, which was in the middle of its lunch service, the line out the door the way it always is on a Friday, and I found Delia in the back kitchen, and I told her what had happened. She listened without expression until I finished. Then she sat down on the stool she keeps next to the bread station and was quiet for a long moment. She told me, Delia said finally. About 3 years ago, this was before any of the health stuff, she said. Delia, one of these days this place is going to need a real owner again, and I want to make sure it still has something worth owning when that day comes. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. She stood up, smoothed her apron. Congratulations, she said, in the tone of someone who means it simply, without complication. I want to tell you about the phone call with my mother because I think it's the part of this story I've spent the most time sitting with. She picked up on the 3rd ring. My Uncle Elliot was apparently at her house. I could hear him in the background. The particular register of a man who has received news he considers unfair. My mother's voice was controlled. It is almost always controlled. She is the kind of person whose composure is genuine rather than performed, which makes it both more admirable and more difficult to reach through. She said she thought my grandmother had been confused. I told her the codicil had been prepared 14 months ago, witnessed and notarized, and that Ms. Hargrove had confirmed it was legally sound. She said she thought it was a reaction to her conversations with the hospitality group, that Grandmère had overreacted. I told her that those conversations had apparently been ongoing for considerably longer than she'd suggested, and that my grandmother had known about them. There was a long pause. She could have just said something, my mother said. If she had feelings about what we were planning, she could have said something. Mom, I said. She did say something. She just said it in the only language she was sure you'd understand. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was different, not angry anymore. Or not only angry, something underneath the anger that I hadn't heard from her in a very long time. Something that sounded like someone who has been carrying a weight for so long they've forgotten it's a weight, and not just the shape of the world. She always chose you, my mother said. Every decision she made, even this one, I thought about what to say. I thought about all the things that were true, that would still hurt to hear. She loved you, I said. I think she just loved you in the way that she showed, which was by taking the long view. She wanted you to have something real, She thought she was giving you that with the property. I stopped. I think she also knew you were going to sell it. And she couldn't let that happen. Both things can be true. My mother didn't say anything. You can still be part of this, I said. The bakery is still her bakery. It always will be. You can come down whenever you want. The kitchen you grew up in is still there. She said she needed time. I said that was fair. She hung up and I sat on the back steps of Delacroix in the October afternoon light. The smell of the bread and the particular coolness of Southern Oregon in fall. And I thought about the version of my grandmother who had sat alone with a decision like this for 14 months, who had written that letter and sealed it in a box, and trusted Delia to know when the time was right, and I thought that I had absolutely no idea how to hold that much love and practicality at the same time. And that maybe the rest of my life would be the work of learning. Elliot did not call. I didn't expect him to. There were things that were hard in the months that followed. And I want to name them because the story isn't complete if I only tell you about the part that felt like justice. Closing my cafe in Portland was not simple, not logistically, not emotionally. I had employees I cared about. I had a lease with 18 months left on it. I had a neighborhood that had become mine. I spent 3 weeks in November managing the transition, subletting the space to a couple who were opening a wine bar, making sure my pastry chef, a 26-year-old named Jerome, who was significantly more talented than I was at his age, had landed somewhere worthy of him. He got a job in Seattle. I told him that in 5 years, nobody was going to believe he'd worked for me, and I meant it as a compliment, and he understood it that way. I moved to Jacksonville in December. I stayed in the apartment above the bakery, in the room my grandmother had slept in for 15 years, in the bed she'd had since before my mother was born. The first morning I woke up there, I lay still for a long time, listening to the sounds of the building, the settling, and the early street noise, and the specific creak of the back stairs. And then I got up and went down to the kitchen, because Delia had already been there for an hour, and the croissants weren't going to shape themselves. Delia and I spent the first 2 months working through what needed to stay and what needed to change, which turned out to be less than I'd expected and more than I'd feared. The menu needed some updating. My grandmother had been conservative about it in her later years, which had preserved the classics at the cost of some freshness. The equipment needed 1 significant repair and 2 replacements. The supplier relationships needed to be renegotiated because some of them had been running on 30-year loyalty and nominal pricing that wasn't going to survive new ownership without an explicit conversation. We had those conversations. Most of them went well. The thing that didn't need changing was the bread. My grandmother's sourdough starter was in a ceramic crock in the back of the refrigerator, labeled in her handwriting with a date that put it at 47 years old, and I treated it with the specific reverence it deserved, which is to say, I checked it every morning before I did anything else, and I talked to it more than I talk to most people. I called it staying grounded. Delia called it worrying about fermentation. She wasn't wrong. The recipe journals became something I hadn't expected them to be. I'd thought of them as sentimental, irreplaceable in the way that things belonging to people you've loved are irreplaceable, but practically limited. I was wrong. They were a working document. Every recipe had marginal notes in 3 or 4 different inks, spanning different decades, recording what had worked and what hadn't, and why, and in what weather, and with which flour. They were 60 years of accumulated knowledge in a form I could actually use, and I spent my evenings that first winter, sitting at the corner table with a glass of wine, and working through them, the way you work through a book that keeps stopping you on every page. My mother came in February. She didn't announce she was coming, she texted. The day before, thinking about driving down tomorrow if that's okay. I told her the coffee was always on. She arrived at 10 in the morning, on a Saturday, and she stood in the doorway of Delacroix for a moment before she came in, looking at the room the way a person looks at something they haven't let themselves look at in a very long time. I brought her coffee. We sat at the corner table, the one my grandmother had used for the books, the one I'd been using for the journals, and we sat with the sounds of the bakery around us, the low voices, the espresso machine, the bell over the door, and we didn't say very much for a while. She picked up one of the journals that was sitting on the table. She turned the pages slowly. Her expression was the kind that people have when they're feeling something they haven't named yet. I remember watching her write in these, she said. When I was little, she'd sit at this table after closing, and I'd come downstairs in my pajamas, and she'd let me sit with her, and she'd write in her notebooks, and I'd draw pictures on the back of the order forms. She turned another page. I thought it was the most boring thing in the world. What did you think was the most exciting thing in the world? I asked. She almost smiled. Getting out of Jacksonville. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would have been useful. She stayed for 3 hours. She walked through the kitchen, which Delia showed her without ceremony. Just, here is what we changed. Here is what we kept. Here is the starter. Yes, it's the same one. Yes, that crock has been here since 1978. My mother touched the crock very briefly with 2 fingers. The way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to touch. Before she left, she stopped at the front window and looked out at Main Street. The blue shutters. The walnut sign. She kept it exactly the same, she said. Not to me specifically. Just to the room. To whoever was listening. Yeah, I said. She did. My mother turned and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, or maybe I had, a long time ago, but hadn't known how to read it yet. Like someone who has been defending against something for so long that they've forgotten what they were defending against, and now the defense has come down and they're not sure what's left. I should have come more, she said. Not an apology. Exactly. Just a fact, stated plainly. The way people state facts when they've finally stopped arguing with them. Yeah, I said again. But you're here now. She left around 1. I stood in the doorway and watched her car go down Main Street and turn at the corner. And then I went back inside because the lunch crowd was picking up and Delia had already given me a look. My Uncle Elliot never came. I stopped expecting him to somewhere around March. There are things I think about now, running this place, that I couldn't have understood from the outside. The particular weight of a business that carries history not just your own, not just your grandmother's, but the history of everyone who has ever sat at these tables. Bought a birthday cake at this counter. Come in on a hard morning because something here made the morning less hard. I had a regular, a man in his 70s named Gerald, who came in every Tuesday and ordered the same thing. Black coffee, a plain croissant, and sat by the window and read the physical paper. He'd been doing it for 31 years, since my grandmother started carrying that particular croissant. He told me this 3 months after I took over, without preamble, just sat down one Tuesday and said, I want you to know I've been coming here since 1993, and I hope you'll keep the plain ones. I told him the plain ones weren't going anywhere. He nodded and opened his paper. I understood that I had just made a commitment. That's what the place is made of. Not the building. Not the equipment. 31 years of Gerald on a Tuesday morning. 22 years of Delia. Knowing which suppliers to trust. 61 years of my grandmother choosing, every single morning, to make the thing she made with full attention and genuine care. The operational trust carried us through the first year more comfortably than I'd expected. The second year, we broke even on our own. The third year, I hired a second pastry chef, a woman named Isabel, who had trained in Lyon, which felt right in a way I couldn't fully articulate, and we opened a small second space in Ashland. Not a second location? Exactly. More of an outpost. A place to sell the bread and a few pastries in the morning and close by noon. The walnut sign above the door was made by a local woodworker from a piece of oak, hand-lettered, because some things earn the right to be done the same way twice. There's a question I get asked sometimes, by people who hear this story, and I've told it a few times now, to people I trust, and it has a way of spreading in the way that stories like this do. The question is whether I think my grandmother was right to do what she did, whether it was fair, whether a grandmother should outmaneuver her own children, legally and deliberately, to get to the outcome she wanted. I've thought about it honestly. Here's what I think. My grandmother was a businesswoman for 61 years. She understood contracts. She understood contingencies. She understood that the distance between good intentions and actual outcomes is often very long and very full of opportunities for things to go wrong. She made a plan. She made it carefully, quietly, 14 months before she died, and she waited to see whether it would be needed. And when the moment came, Delia knew when. Was it a lesson? I think yes, but not a punishment. There's a difference, and I think my grandmother understood it better than most. My mother called me last April, on a Tuesday afternoon. She had met with a therapist, she said, which she mentioned with the careful nonchalance of someone who has decided to do a thing and doesn't want to make a production of it. She said some things about the past year, about the bakery, about growing up in a place that felt more like a standard than a home. She said them matter-of-factly, without performance, The way my grandmother said things. I listened without interrupting. When she was done, I told her I was glad she called. She said she might want to come down again in the summer, when she could stay a few days. I said the apartment above the bakery had a second bedroom that nobody was using. She came in July. She helped with the Saturday morning rush, which she jumped into without being asked, just put on an apron and started refilling the coffee station because it was obviously what needed to happen. Delia watched this from the bread counter without comment. Later, when my mother was in the back washing the baking sheets with a thoroughness that would have made my grandmother nod, Delia came up beside me and said, very quietly, "She knows where everything goes." And I understood that my grandmother had not only built a place, but a way of being in a place, and that it lives in people even when they spend decades trying to live somewhere else. There is something I go back to often. A morning last January, the kind of Oregon morning that is mostly gray and completely still, the mountains barely visible through the overcast, and the street outside quiet in the way that small towns are quiet before the world properly wakes up. I was in the kitchen at 5:30 doing the first check of the bread, the same check my grandmother did every morning. The same sequence starter, proof, temperature, timing, and I was doing it alone, nobody else in yet. Just me and the warmth of the ovens, and the smell that is the deepest smell I know. And I thought, this is the inheritance, not the codicil, not the trust, not the property value or the appraisal or the legal machinery that moved a piece of commercial real estate from one set of names to another. This standing alone in a kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, knowing where everything is, knowing what needs to happen next, feeling in your body that you are exactly the right person to be doing this exact thing in this exact place. That's the thing my grandmother was protecting, not the building, the work, the specific, unglamorous, daily, necessary work of making something real and making it well, and making it again tomorrow. She knew I understood that. She'd watched me understand it at 9 years old, elbow deep in dough, completely still. She just had to make sure the kitchen was still there when I was ready to come back to it.